people like to believe the Winchester House exists because one woman lost her mind. That explanation is comforting. It lets everyone walk away. Because if this house was built from madness, then it has nothing to do with power, nothing to do with money, nothing to do with fear that makes sense. It becomes a curiosity, a haunted attraction, a story you can laugh at and leave behind. But that belief collapses the moment you stop looking at the house as a joke and start looking at it as a system. By the year 1890, in San Jose, California, the structure was already consuming money at a pace that would have bankrupted almost anyone else. Construction did not pause. It did not slow for seasons. It did not end when walls reached ceilings or when rooms lost purpose. Staircases led nowhere. Doors opened into solid walls. Windows were placed into floors. Corridors bent, narrowed, and turned back on themselves. People say this proves insanity, but insanity does not pay wages, manage crews, negotiate suppliers, or maintain continuity for decades. Insanity does not require discipline. What if the mistake is assuming the house was meant to make sense to outsiders? From the beginning, this structure behaved less like a home and more like a defensive response, not against a visible enemy, against uncertainty itself. By the late 1880s, Sarah Winchester was already one of the wealthiest women in the United States of America. She did not inherit money in pieces. She inherited a machine, a flow of capital so steady it seemed permanent. Her fortune came from the Winchester Repeating Arms Company, a firm whose rifles had reshaped warfare, westward expansion, and the balance of power between individuals and the state. The popular story stops there and jumps directly to ghosts. But history does not move in jumps. It moves in pressure. The United States of America in the 1880s was not stable. It was expanding too fast, industrializing too violently, and concentrating wealth at a scale that made resentment unavoidable. Labor strikes erupted across railroads and factories. Entire towns rose and collapsed around industries that consumed human bodies as efficiently as they consumed resources. Newspapers openly warned of class conflict. Politicians spoke about trust-busting and taxation in tones that frightened old money. This was not an abstract fear. This was a system beginning to turn on itself. Sarah Winchester did not need to be told that her wealth came from death. The accounting records already did that. Every rifle sold represented control over territory, labor, or rebellion. The rifles were legal, profitable, celebrated. But legality has never guaranteed safety. What made the Winchester fortune powerful also made it visible. And visibility is dangerous when systems destabilize. The first assumption people make is that Sarah Winchester built to escape guilt, that she was haunted by the people killed by the Winchester rifle, that she believed spirits were coming for her. That theory is seductive because it personalizes blame. But fear at this scale is rarely spiritual alone. It is structural. By the time construction began in earnest in 1884, Sarah Winchester had already withdrawn from public life. Not in grief alone, but in pattern. Wealthy families in this period did not isolate themselves without reason. The more money concentrated, the more necessary distance became. Distance from courts, distance from journalists, distance from political movements that could redefine legitimacy overnight. The house did not begin as a finished plan, because fear does not arrive fully formed. It accumulates. At first, expansion feels reasonable. A new wing, additional rooms, more distance between oneself and the outside world. But when the outside world keeps changing, construction stops being improvement and becomes insulation. The Winchester House expanded the way fortifications once did. Not outward in symmetry, but inward in layers. Corridors became filters. Rooms became buffers. Navigation became intentionally difficult. Movement slowed. Sound softened. Lines of sight fractured. This was not architectural incompetence. It was defensive confusion. People assume the irrational design was meant to confuse ghosts. But confusion has always been more useful against people than spirits. Intruders hesitate when spaces defy expectation. Outsiders lose orientation. Servants move according to habit, not logic. Control shifts to those who already know the maze. The house rewarded familiarity, and punished intrusion. That is not madness. That is hierarchy. Construction crews were rotated but never eliminated. Wages were paid consistently. Materials were ordered constantly. No single worker saw the full plan, because there was no full plan to see. The structure responded to pressure, not blueprints. This is where the ghost story becomes a distraction. Because the real question is not whether Sarah Winchester believed she was being followed by the dead. The real question is why she believed stopping construction would be dangerous. Fear of collapse does not announce itself as fear. It announces itself as necessity. By the late 19th century, old industrial wealth faced a paradox. Money could buy distance, but it could not buy legitimacy. Public opinion was turning. Populist movements were questioning inheritance. Newspapers printed exposés on monopolies. Courts debated liability. Politicians debated reform. And reform, to old money, feels like collapse. Sarah Winchester did not need a prophecy to understand that systems can turn. She lived inside one that already had. The firearm industry existed because governments and borders failed to contain violence. The same instability that sold rifles could easily turn against those who profited from them. The house grew not because it was haunted, but because stopping would mean acknowledging that protection had limits. Endless construction created the illusion of motion without exposure. As long as work continued, nothing had to be finalized. No permanent shape meant no permanent vulnerability. No finished facade meant no fixed target. This is why the house feels unfinished even now, because it was never meant to be complete. Completion implies confidence. Completion implies safety. Fear builds systems that must never end. Visitors today walk through the Winchester House and laugh at staircases that lead nowhere. They call it absurd. They photograph it. They leave. What they do not ask is why absurdity would be preferable to order. Order invites scrutiny. Order invites mapping. Order invites regulation. Chaos protects. By the time the house reached dozens of rooms, Sarah Winchester rarely appeared in public. Her world had collapsed inward, not from madness, but from calculation shaped by uncertainty. The more unpredictable the external world became, the more elaborate the internal system grew. This is the first uncomfortable truth people avoid. The Winchester House was not built because Sarah Winchester feared ghosts. It was built because she feared what happens when wealth loses protection. And that fear did not come from superstition. It came from watching a world where power was shifting faster than anyone could control. The question that remains, and the one most people never ask, is this. If the house was a defense, what exactly was it defending against, and why did fear demand it never stop growing? If you want to understand that, you cannot look at the walls. You have to look at the system that paid for them. To understand why the Winchester House kept growing, you have to stop thinking about the building and start thinking about the machinery that made it possible. Fear does not act alone. Fear needs fuel. And in this case, the fuel was an industrial system that had outgrown the moral and political structures meant to contain it. By the year 1870, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company was no longer simply a manufacturer. It was an infrastructure of power. Its rifles were not just tools. They were multipliers. They changed how wars were fought, how land was taken, and how authority was enforced. The lever-action rifle compressed violence into efficiency. One person could now control space, time, and outcome in ways that had previously required numbers. That kind of power does not remain invisible for long. As the 19th century progressed, the United States of America entered a phase historians later called the Gilded Age. The name itself was a warning. Gilded means covered, not solid. Beneath the shine of rapid growth and innovation sat fragile foundations. Extreme inequality, volatile labor conditions, and a legal system struggling to keep pace with corporations that operated across states, courts, and political cycles. Old money families sensed this instability long before it appeared in textbooks. They saw it in strikes that shut down railroads. They saw it in mobs that attacked factories. They saw it in newspapers that no longer praised industrialists as heroes but portrayed them as parasites. Wealth was no longer just admired, It was interrogated. The Winchester fortune sat at a particularly dangerous intersection. It was not abstract finance or distant land holdings. It was weapons, tangible, traceable, and morally charged. Every public conversation about violence, expansion, or repression had the potential to circle back to the rifle. This is where the ghost story becomes insufficient. Fear rooted in superstition is chaotic. Fear rooted in systems is precise. Records from the late 19th century show increasing legal scrutiny around manufacturers. Product liability was evolving. Courts were beginning to entertain the idea that corporations could be held responsible for harm beyond immediate transactions. Politicians debated regulation with language that unsettled those who had grown wealthy in legal gray zones. For someone like Sarah Winchester, this was not background noise. This was a direct threat to the architecture of her security. She had inherited a fortune built on a single product category in a society that was starting to question the consequences of that product. The rifles had been essential during periods of expansion and conflict. But what happens when the nation begins to look backward instead of forward? What happens when the same tools that enabled growth are reframed as symbols of exploitation? Fear of collapse often begins as fear of redefinition. Old money families understood that laws change faster than reputations. Once legitimacy is questioned, distance becomes survival. Not just physical distance, but narrative distance. Privacy, complexity, obscurity. The Winchester House begins to look different when viewed through this lens. Its irregularity mirrors the legal and moral ambiguity surrounding the wealth that sustained it. There is no single grand facade announcing dominance. There is no symmetrical declaration of permanence. Instead, there is fragmentation, addition upon addition, layers without a central point of failure. This mirrors how industrial wealth protected itself during periods of uncertainty. Trusts were created, shell companies formed, assets diversified and buried under complexity. Visibility was reduced deliberately. The house was not separate from these strategies. It was a physical expression of the same instinct. By continuously building, Sarah Winchester avoided finality. A finished estate invites assessment. It can be appraised, taxed, regulated, or seized. An unfinished system is harder to categorize. It exists in flux. It resists closure. This matters more than it seems. Taxation policies in the late 19th century were in flux. States experimented with property taxes, inheritance taxes, and valuation methods. Wealth that could not be cleanly assessed was wealth that retained flexibility. Endless construction blurred boundaries between asset, expense, and process. Money flowing into labor and materials became harder to trace as static accumulation. Fear, in this context, was not irrational. It was adaptive. But adaptation has a cost. To sustain continuous construction, Sarah Winchester required a constant supply chain. Lumber mills, glassmakers, metal workers, and transport networks all fed into the house. This created dependency. Entire local economies became entangled with her decisions. Wages paid regularly purchased not just labor, but silence, loyalty, and stability. This is a pattern seen repeatedly in elite survival strategies. When fear of exposure grows, elites embed themselves economically into their surroundings. They become indispensable. Collapse becomes inconvenient not just for them, but for everyone nearby. The house functioned as a stabilizer in an unstable world. But stabilization does not remove pressure. It redistributes it. Workers built rooms they did not understand. They followed instructions without context. No one saw the whole structure because no one needed to. Fragmentation protected the center. This mirrors the corporate structures of the same era. Factories were segmented. Labor was specialized. Responsibility was diffused. Harm became abstracted. Accountability dissolved into process. The Winchester House was not an anomaly. It was a domestic-scale version of an industrial logic, and that logic was under threat. By the 1890s, political movements advocating labor rights, antitrust laws, and wealth redistribution gained momentum. Old money families watched as public sentiment shifted from admiration to suspicion. The idea that fortunes could be dismantled legally became plausible. Fear of collapse does not always mean fear of physical destruction. More often, it means fear of losing control over the rules. Sarah Winchester lived in a world where rules were being rewritten in real time. The rifles that once symbolized progress now symbolized excess. The wealth that once guaranteed respect now invited scrutiny. The privacy that once protected elites now looked like secrecy. In that environment, building became more than habit. It became ritualized defense. Every hammer strike was a declaration that the system was still functioning. Every new corridor postponed reckoning. As long as the house expanded, the future remained deferred. This is where psychological pressure deepens. Fear, sustained over decades, does not remain sharp. It becomes ambient. It embeds itself into routines. Construction did not respond to a single event. It responded to a continuous sense that stopping would invite exposure. Stopping would force evaluation. Evaluation invites judgment. Judgment invites consequences. This is why the house never resolved its contradictions. Why rooms contradict staircases. Why design resists interpretation. Ambiguity is protective. It frustrates narrative closure. Even today, visitors search for meaning in the structure and leave with confusion. That confusion is not accidental. It is the residue of a system designed to resist understanding. But fear cannot be fed indefinitely without creating new vulnerabilities. The more complex the system becomes, the harder it is to maintain. Continuous construction required constant oversight, constant spending, constant engagement with the very labor force that elites often feared. This introduces tension. Dependence on workers creates exposure. Workers talk. Workers observe. Workers form opinions. The system that protects wealth also brings it into contact with those who may resent it. Fear responds by tightening control. Contracts become stricter. Access becomes limited. Spaces become compartmentalized. Trust becomes conditional. The house, by this stage, was no longer just a response to external pressure. It had become a pressure system itself. Fear had created a structure that required fear to continue existing. This is the trap of defensive complexity. Once built, it cannot be dismantled without revealing what it was built to hide. The Winchester House began as insulation against uncertainty. But insulation thickens walls. Thick walls isolate. Isolation distorts perception. External threats feel larger. Internal systems feel more necessary. The cycle reinforces itself. By the end of the 19th century, Sarah Winchester's life was almost entirely contained within this expanding system. The world outside continued to change, but engagement with it became filtered through layers of architecture, labor, and routine. This was not withdrawal. It was containment. Containment of risk, containment of accountability, containment of fear, and yet, containment does not equal resolution. The question that starts to surface, quietly at first, is whether the house was still responding to the original threat, or whether it had become a monument to fear itself. Because when systems are built to survive collapse, they sometimes begin to depend on the collapse they were meant to prevent. And once fear becomes infrastructure, dismantling it feels more dangerous than living inside it. That is the moment where protection turns into captivity, and it raises a deeper question that cannot be answered by architecture alone. If the machinery behind the fear was financial, legal, and political, then who, exactly, was paying the price for keeping it running? If fear required machinery to sustain itself, then that machinery needed hands, not symbols, not legends, actual people. And this is where the story becomes less abstract and more uncomfortable, because protection at the top has always depended on invisibility at the bottom. The Winchester House did not rise on fear alone. It rose on routine, on repetition, on labor that showed up every morning without ever being told what the finished structure was supposed to become. In the late 19th century, California was still a place of economic flux. The promise of opportunity attracted workers who had already been displaced by railroads, failed farms, closed mines, and collapsing towns. Skilled carpenters moved where work was steady. Unskilled labor followed wages wherever they appeared. Stability mattered more than meaning, and the Winchester House offered something rare in that environment: continuity. Construction did not stop for recessions. It did not stop for personal tragedy. It did not stop for earthquakes. Work continued quietly, predictably, day after day. That consistency mattered. It anchored lives that otherwise floated between uncertainty and desperation. This is the first moral inversion people miss. The house did not just consume labor. It organized it. Carpenters were not asked to design. They were asked to build. Glassworkers installed windows without being told why they faced inward or downward. Stair builders assembled steps without knowing they would end abruptly. Each task was isolated, bounded, and paid. This fragmentation was not accidental. When labor is fragmented, understanding disappears. When understanding disappears, responsibility dissolves. No single worker feels accountable for the whole. No single worker feels entitled to question purpose. This is how systems protect themselves. The Winchester House functioned less like a residence and more like a distributed workplace. Its primary output was not shelter, it was employment, and employment created loyalty, silence, and dependence. Workers who relied on steady wages were unlikely to speculate publicly about the motivations behind the project. Speculation threatens income, silence preserves it. Fear at the top converted money into compliance below, but that compliance came at a cost. Endless construction is not neutral. It exhausts bodies. It erodes meaning. It turns skill into repetition. Workers built spaces that would never be lived in, rooms that would never be used, passages designed to confuse rather than serve. Over time, this creates a subtle psychological toll. Labor is easier to endure when purpose is visible, when outcome is clear, when completion promises relief. But here, completion was forbidden. Completion would mean the system had failed to anticipate the next threat. So labor never resolved. It cycled. The house absorbed effort the way a machine absorbs fuel, without ever signaling when enough had been given. This matters because fear does not just flow downward. It accumulates. Workers may not have known the full logic of the house, but they felt its mood. The quiet insistence on continuation, the avoidance of explanation, the sense that questions were unwelcome, that certain areas were restricted, that privacy mattered more than clarity. Over time, the house trained behavior. Movement followed familiar paths. Noise was moderated. Access became conditional. Trust was built through proximity, not understanding. This is how elite fear reshapes social space. The Winchester House did not need guards or walls. It relied on familiarity and dependence. Those who belonged inside learned how to move within it. Those who did not were disoriented. But dependence is never one-directional. As the house grew more complex, Sarah Winchester's reliance on labor deepened. She needed skilled hands to translate anxiety into structure. She needed people who would show up consistently, follow instructions precisely, and not ask why. That reliance introduced vulnerability. Every worker represented a point of exposure. Someone who could observe patterns. Someone who could speak. Someone who could leave. Fear responds to vulnerability by narrowing trust. Access became segmented. Workers were assigned zones. Knowledge was compartmentalized. The whole remained unknowable by design. This mirrors how corporations manage risk. Silos prevent leaks. Specialization limits awareness. Accountability is distributed so thinly that it evaporates. The house was not just built like a maze, it was managed like one. And within that maze, the human cost accumulated quietly. Servants navigated shifting layouts daily. What had been a corridor became a wall. What had been a window became a door. Memory was constantly invalidated. Orientation required constant adjustment. This erodes agency. When environments change unpredictably, people stop trusting their own understanding. They defer to authority. They wait for instruction. They adapt rather than challenge. Fear thrives in such conditions. The Winchester House, intentionally or not, became an environment that trained compliance through instability. not dramatic instability. Subtle, continuous, low-grade disorientation. This is the second uncomfortable truth. Fear at the top does not always produce violence. Sometimes it produces systems that quietly wear people down. And yet, those people were not passive victims. Workers talked among themselves. They noticed patterns. They speculated privately. They developed their own explanations. Ghost stories flourished not because spirits were seen, but because mystery demands narrative. When official explanations are absent, informal ones fill the void. The supernatural narrative served a function. It gave shape to unease. It provided language for something that felt wrong, but could not be articulated in economic or political terms. Ghosts were safer than truth. To say the house was haunted was less dangerous than to say it was built to protect wealth from social backlash. Less dangerous than to say fear had turned architecture into control. Superstition displaced critique, and this displacement benefited the system. Visitors would later laugh at the idea of ghosts, but they would not ask harder questions about labor, money, and power. The myth deflected scrutiny away from structures that still exist today, but inside the house, the human cost continued to mount. Endless work without resolution distorts time. Days blur, seasons lose meaning, progress becomes circular. This kind of labor drains identity. People become functions. This is the price of insulation. Fear converts money into walls. Walls require hands. Hands bear the weight of decisions made elsewhere. And yet, the system was not cruel in obvious ways. Wages were paid. Conditions were not unusually brutal for the era. That is what makes it harder to see. Control does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrives with consistency. Consistency that demands silence. Consistency that rewards compliance. Consistency that discourages disruption. The Winchester House stabilized lives, even as it hollowed out purpose. This paradox mirrors broader patterns in industrial societies. Systems that protect elites often provide enough stability to prevent revolt, while never offering enough agency to threaten control. Fear shapes incentives carefully, and still, cracks appeared. As years passed, workers aged. Some left, new ones arrived. Knowledge dissolved. Oral histories fragmented. The original logic of construction became less clear, even to those inside the system. At that point, the house was no longer responding to a specific fear. It was responding to inertia. Inertia is dangerous. Systems built to protect against collapse can become blind to change. They repeat patterns long after conditions shift. They preserve processes rather than reassess threats. The Winchester House had become such a system, its continuous construction no longer clearly mapped to external risks. It persisted because stopping felt riskier than continuing. Fear had lost its object but retained its momentum. And momentum requires fuel. That fuel was human effort. The house demanded bodies to justify its existence. Without workers, the illusion would collapse. Without activity, the fear would have to confront itself. So, activity continued. This is where the moral cost becomes unavoidable. When fear becomes infrastructure, it externalizes its burden. It transfers anxiety downward and converts it into labor. Those who benefit from protection are shielded from the exhaustion that maintains it. The Winchester House was not unique in this. It was simply visible. Many systems operate the same way, hidden behind offices, factories, supply chains, and bureaucracies. They convert insecurity at the top into pressure below. The difference here is that the architecture made the process literal. Every strange room was built by someone. Every useless staircase was climbed during construction. Every blocked window represented hours of work that served no human need except preservation of an illusion. And that illusion was that control could be maintained indefinitely. The workers may not have articulated this, but they lived inside it. The longer the house grew, the more it revealed a deeper truth. Fear does not end when protected. It adapts. Protection raises the stakes. It increases dependence on the system. It narrows the margin for failure. At some point, the question stops being whether collapse can be avoided. It becomes whether the system itself has become a form of collapse, Stretched out over time, the Winchester House had reached that point. It was stable enough to continue, fragile enough to never stop. And that is the most dangerous state a system can occupy. Because when protection depends on constant extraction from others, any disruption becomes catastrophic. Which raises the next unavoidable tension. What happens when pressure from outside finally reaches a system that has trained itself to only respond by expanding? What happens when fear can no longer be fed quietly? That is where rupture begins. Pressure does not announce itself with explosions. It arrives as reminders, as small, undeniable signals that a system built to absorb fear is no longer fully in control. For the Winchester House, those reminders did not come from ghosts or rumors. They came from reality asserting itself through law, nature, and time. By the early 20th century, the world that had produced the Winchester fortune was changing faster than the house could adapt. The United States of America had entered an era of reform. Antitrust laws were no longer theoretical. Progressive politics questioned inherited wealth openly. Journalists were empowered by a growing public appetite for exposure. The distance that once insulated elite families from scrutiny was shrinking. The house, built to avoid finality, now existed in a society that increasingly demanded it. This is where the logic of endless construction began to fracture. A system designed to respond to uncertainty by expanding assumes that expansion itself remains possible. But expansion requires permission, materials, labor, legal tolerance, social patience. When those inputs tighten, the system is forced to confront limits it was never designed to face. And limits feel like collapse to systems built on avoidance. One of the most visible ruptures came not from politics, but from geology. In April of 1906, a massive earthquake struck San Francisco and surrounding areas, including San Jose, California. Buildings collapsed, fires followed, entire neighborhoods were erased within hours. The physical environment that had allowed the Winchester House to grow uninterrupted was suddenly unstable. The earthquake did more than damage structures. It exposed fragility. Sections of the Winchester House were destroyed. Upper floors collapsed. Architectural illusions failed. Staircases that had led nowhere now led into rubble. The maze lost its coherence. What had been confusing became visibly broken. This moment matters because it forced an encounter with reality that the system had been built to avoid. For the first time in decades, construction stopped, not by choice, but by necessity. In systems built on fear, interruption is dangerous. It creates space for reflection. It invites questions that have been postponed for years. Why had so much been built? What had it achieved? What had it protected against? The earthquake stripped away the illusion of control. It demonstrated that no amount of complexity could fully insulate against external forces. Nature did not care about fear, money, or ritual. And yet, the response to this rupture reveals something even more unsettling. Rather than abandoning the system, Sarah Winchester adapted it. After the earthquake, she chose not to rebuild certain destroyed sections. Upper floors were sealed off. Areas became inaccessible. The house contracted in some places, while continuing to function in others. The system did not end. It reconfigured. This is how defensive systems survive failure. They redefine success. What had once been growth became containment. What had once been expansion became fortification. The goal was no longer to build endlessly upward, but to maintain control within reduced boundaries. Fear shifted shape. This adaptation signals a critical transition. The house was no longer reacting to an external threat in real time. It was reacting to its own exposure. The earthquake had revealed too much. It had shown that the maze was not invincible. In response, access tightened. Visibility decreased. The inner system grew more opaque. At the same time, public attention intensified. Stories about the house spread. Journalists and curious visitors arrived. The supernatural narrative gained momentum because it offered a spectacle that distracted from deeper analysis. People focused on strange architecture rather than structural meaning. The myth became armor. This is a recurring pattern in elite survival strategies. When scrutiny increases, Eccentricity is safer than transparency. It frames behavior as personal rather than systemic. It invites ridicule instead of investigation. Being seen as strange is preferable to being seen as threatened, but ridicule has limits. As public awareness grew, so did the risk of interpretation. The house became a symbol, even if people did not agree on what it symbolized. Symbols attract attention. Attention invites regulation. Regulation threatens autonomy. The Winchester House had always relied on staying one step ahead of categorization. Now, categories were closing in. Legal pressure also continued to evolve. Property laws matured. Inheritance structures were scrutinized. Governments sought reliable ways to assess and tax wealth. Complexity no longer guaranteed invisibility. It increasingly looked like evasion. This created a new kind of fear. Not fear of collapse from the outside, but fear of being forced into clarity. Clarity is dangerous for systems built on ambiguity. At this stage, the house began to feel less like protection and more like evidence. Evidence of something unresolved. Evidence of anxiety turned architectural. Evidence of a system that had outlived its original logic. The more it persisted, the harder it was to explain. This is where moral compromise deepens. To keep the system alive, resources had to continue flowing into it. Labor still had to be managed. Privacy still had to be enforced. The costs of maintenance rose as the benefits became less clear. Fear had become expensive. An expensive fear demands justification, but justification was no longer readily available. The original threat had diffused. Society had not collapsed. Wealth had not been seized. The world had changed, but not in the apocalyptic way early fears may have anticipated. This creates cognitive dissonance. When a system survives the crisis it was built for, it faces a choice: dismantle itself or invent new reasons to exist. The Winchester House chose the latter. Its meaning shifted from defense to legacy, from protection to inevitability. It became something that simply was, rather than something that needed to be explained. This is how systems avoid accountability. They normalize themselves, but normalization does not eliminate risk. It obscures it. Internally, the burden remained. Maintaining the house required continuous effort. Managing access required constant vigilance. Isolation deepened. The world outside grew louder, faster, and more interconnected, while the world inside remained deliberately disjointed. This divergence intensifies fear, rather than resolving it. The more insulated the system became, the more alien the outside world appeared. Every reform felt threatening. Every new law felt invasive. Every journalist felt like an intruder. Fear feeds on distance. At this point, the house had fully inverted its original purpose. It was no longer primarily a response to external instability. It had become the environment that sustained internal instability. Fear no longer needed new threats. It generated its own. The architecture reinforced this. Narrow corridors limited movement. Unexpected barriers disrupted routine. Familiarity became essential for navigation. Outsiders were perpetually disoriented. This disorientation mirrored Sarah Winchester's relationship with the broader society. The more the house defined her world, the less comprehensible the outside became. And yet, the outside world did not stop changing. Industrial capitalism continued to evolve. Corporations grew larger, governments more assertive. The very systems that had once enabled elite autonomy were now centralizing power. The paradox sharpened. Wealth was safer than ever in aggregate, yet felt more vulnerable than ever personally. This paradox drives some of the most extreme defensive behaviors in history. When people feel both powerful and exposed, they build. They build walls. They build systems. They build complexity. But complexity has a breaking point. The Winchester House, by this stage, had reached it, not because it collapsed physically, but because its logic could no longer expand without contradiction. It had become too visible to remain invisible, too famous to be private, too strange to be ignored. The system that was meant to disappear into the background had become the foreground. This is the moment when fear stops working as protection and starts functioning as confinement. Sarah Winchester lived inside a structure that no longer served its original purpose, yet could not be abandoned without emotional and symbolic loss. To leave would mean admitting that the fear had been misplaced or excessive. Admitting that would be destabilizing. So, the system persisted, even as its effectiveness declined. This is not madness, it is sunk cost. When vast resources are invested in avoiding collapse, acknowledging that collapse did not arrive does not bring relief. It brings uncertainty. What if the threat was simply delayed? What if stopping invites it now? Fear reframes absence as anticipation. And so the house remained in tension, stable enough to endure, unstable enough to demand constant attention. The rupture had not destroyed it. It had exposed it. What followed was not resolution, but endurance without clarity, which raises a final, unsettling question. If the house had survived the crisis it was built for, what was it surviving for now? And, if fear had become its own justification, what happens when the person at the center of the system can no longer sustain it? That is where the story leaves architecture behind and begins to resemble something much closer to the present. When Sarah Winchester died in September of 1922, the house did not collapse. That, more than anything else, reveals what it had truly become. For decades, the structure had been treated as an extension of one person's fear. Her absence should have ended it. The system should have unraveled, workers dismissed, doors sealed, purpose dissolved. Instead, the house persisted. Within days, construction stopped, not because fear vanished, but because its engine was gone. What remained was not resolution, but residue, a vast physical record of a defensive mindset that had outlived its creator. This is where the story shifts from biography to mirror. The Winchester House did not need Sarah Winchester anymore, because it had already fulfilled its deeper function. It had converted fear into form. It had externalized anxiety into architecture. It had transformed an internal response to uncertainty into something permanent enough to survive its origin. That is the dangerous part of systems built from fear. They do not disappear when fear does. They remain, normalized, inherited, and repurposed. After Sarah Winchester's death, the house was quickly opened to the public. Tours began. Stories were curated. The supernatural narrative hardened into marketing. The maze became entertainment. The disorientation became spectacle. This transformation is often framed as irony, but it is not irony. It is absorption. When systems built to protect elite anxiety lose their private function, they are often repackaged as culture. What once insulated power becomes history, curiosity, tourism. This diffuses threat without dismantling structure. The house stopped being a defense and became a lesson, but only a partial one. Visitors walk through the corridors and marvel at the oddities. They photograph staircases that lead nowhere. They laugh at doors that open into walls. They repeat the ghost stories because they are easy to digest. What they rarely confront is why confusion itself was valuable. The house was never meant to be efficient. It was meant to be unresolvable, and that quality makes it strangely modern. Look around today and the pattern repeats. Wealth increasingly hides behind complexity. Assets are spread across jurisdictions. Ownership is fragmented through layers of legal entities. Homes are fortified not just physically, but digitally. Privacy is purchased through obscurity. Security is achieved through separation. These are not expressions of confidence. They are expressions of fear that has learned how to survive. The Winchester House feels old, but its logic is contemporary. It reflects a belief that collapse is inevitable, but uneven. That systems fail for some while protecting others. That survival depends not on stopping collapse, but on positioning oneself inside structures designed to absorb it. Sarah Winchester did not believe she could control the world. She believed she could outbuild its consequences. That belief has not disappeared. It has scaled. Modern equivalents are not made of wood and glass, but of contracts, algorithms, and borders. Gated communities, private security, offshore accounts, complex supply chains. Each layer adds insulation. Each layer adds distance. Each layer also adds dependence. What the Winchester House reveals, when stripped of myth, is the cost of that approach. Fear-based systems do not resolve uncertainty. They institutionalize it. They require constant maintenance. They demand perpetual input. They transfer anxiety downward and outward, embedding it into labor, space, and routine. They create worlds that function only as long as nothing truly changes. But change is the one thing systems cannot outbuild forever. The house stands today because it was never required to face the ultimate test. Its fear was never fully validated or disproven. The collapse it anticipated never arrived in the form expected. This ambiguity preserved it, and ambiguity is the most powerful shelter fear can find. The house is not a monument to eccentricity. It is a fossil of elite adaptation during a period when power felt unstable and legitimacy felt negotiable. It shows what happens when those with resources choose insulation over engagement, complexity over accountability. The unresolved nature of the structure is not a flaw. It is the point. Fear does not want answers. It wants postponement. Every unfinished room delayed reckoning. Every unnecessary corridor absorbed time. Every confusing turn redirected attention away from the core question. Was the threat real, or was it imagined? That question remains unanswered, and that is why the house endures psychologically, not just physically. The real danger of systems like this is not that they fail. It is that they work just well enough to be copied. They create the illusion of safety while quietly narrowing the world. They reduce exposure but also reduce perspective. They protect assets while eroding meaning. Sarah Winchester did not retreat into the house because she was irrational. She retreated because the world had taught her that wealth without insulation invites retaliation, legal, social, or symbolic. That lesson is still being learned today. When societies experience rapid change, those with power rarely try to stop it. They try to outrun it. They build ahead of it. They hide within it. But the Winchester House suggests a deeper cost. When fear becomes architecture, leaving it behind feels impossible, even when the threat fades. Systems designed for survival begin to define identity. Protection becomes purpose, and when protection becomes purpose, collapse no longer needs to arrive. The system has already won. The house no longer expands, but its logic lives on in quieter, more sophisticated forms. Places where complexity substitutes for trust, where insulation replaces participation, where the future is not shaped, only buffered against. That is the uncomfortable parallel. The Winchester House was not built to defeat collapse. It was built to live beside it indefinitely. So the question this story leaves behind is not whether Sarah Winchester was afraid. It is whether fear, once given structure, ever truly lets go. And if the most powerful people in any era build their lives around avoiding collapse rather than understanding it, what kind of world are they quietly constructing for everyone else? If you want more investigations like this into the systems fear creates and the structures power leaves behind, subscribe. The stories we